World of Warfare presents the Battle of Monte Cassino. By October of 1943, Allied war leaders had been forced into yet another reality check after their original notion of a quick victory in Italy instead bogged down in a bloody standoff at Salerno and a series of defensive lines in central Italy. As the Allies' planned invasion at Normandy grew ever closer, however, the possible capture of Rome was too great a prospect to pass up, not only for its propaganda value, but for the capture of nearby airfields that would provide the Allies with forward bases in their efforts to bomb the Balkans and southern France, at the same time committing German forces to Italy rather than redeployments to either the eastern or western fronts. Over the coming months, the Allies' advance up the Italian peninsula proved painfully slow as they fought their way from mountain to mountain along unpaved roads and rivers lacking operational bridges, with General Mark Clark's Fifth Army advancing up the west coast of Italy, while British General Bernard Montgomery's Eighth Army moved up the east coast through the Foggia Plains toward Pesaro. By November, fog, rain, and mud had turned the countryside into a swamp, forcing the purchase of thousands of Italian pack mules to supply Allied soldiers as they slogged atop unrelenting terrain. While the Eighth Army advanced toward Pescara before turning left toward Rome, the Fifth Army advanced on Rome through the Liri Valley and Highway 6, all the while slowed by German Field Marshal Albert Kesselring's 10th Army, amassed at the Gustav Line, a geographically inspired defensive line which ran across the Italian peninsula from coast to coast. To close in on Rome, the Allies needed to cross the Garigliano and Rapido rivers before securing the high ground around the ancient monastery at Monte Cassino, a place along the Gustav Line that had been heavily fortified by the Germans, including barbed wire, anti-tank ditches, pillboxes, trenches, and concealed anti-tank guns. Deemed nearly impregnable by the Germans, in December, the Eighth Army managed to break through the poorly defended line near the coastal city of Ortona. Yet just as Monte was poised to exploit the breakthrough, his exhausted troops were struck by a blizzard that ground forward progress to a halt. The impasse was made worse in January of 1944, when Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower called Montgomery out of the Mediterranean theater so that they could discuss plans for the D-Day landings, codenamed Operation Overlord. Replaced by Sir Henry Wilson and Sir Oliver Lees, the transfer meant that the Italian campaign was now a British-led theater under the influence of British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who had already expressed his frustration over the Allies' stalled offensive at the Gustav Line. To circumvent the line, Churchill conceived of an amphibious bypass of the Gustav Line at Anzio, codenamed Operation Shingle. Scheduled to go live on January 22nd, two divisions of the 6th Corps under the command of General John P. Lucas would land at the resort town of Anzio, some 30 miles southeast of Rome. The plan was to advance inland to the Alban Hills above Highways 6 and 7, which in itself would threaten Kesselring's supply lines. In advance of Operation Shingle, on January 17th, the British 5th and 56th Divisions made their first attacks on Monte Cassino after crossing the Garigliano River, which prompted Kesselring to deploy his reserve troops from Rome to stabilize the line. 3 days later, when the U.S. Second Corps tried to cross the Rapido River, withering enemy artillery fire caused heavy Allied casualties in the exposed approaches to the waterway. After days of heavy fighting, along with attacks to the north of Cassino by American and French-Moroccan troops, Allied forward progress ground to a halt. On January 22nd, Allied troops came ashore at Anzio, almost entirely unopposed, but rather than strike out for the Alban Hills as Lucas had been ordered, He stalled his advance out of fear that his rearguard troops would be annihilated at the Anzio beachhead if he divided his already undermanned force. Lucas's 9-day wait for additional reinforcements gave Kesselring the time he needed to muster up 8 divisions that now surrounded the Allied beachheads, gathering some 70,000 men with the goal of pushing the Allies back into the sea. Meanwhile, at Monte Cassino, American and French forces continued to attack from the north, allowing the U.S. 34th Division to come within hundreds of yards from the monastery despite heavy losses of men and machines. By mid-February, the U.S. Second Corps had withdrawn from the battle out of sheer exhaustion, quickly replaced by Indian and New Zealand divisions whose commanders called for the total destruction of the historic monastery itself. While the Germans had originally promised not to occupy the monastery, after a month of staring up at the giant monolith, Allied commanders began to believe that the Nazis had German observers inside Monte Cassino who called down artillery strikes, leading to the February 15th bombing of the monastery that witnessed more than 1,000 tons of high explosives and incendiaries dropped on the complex. After the monastery was reduced to rubble, the Allies learned that there had been no German soldiers inside Monte Cassino itself, while their bombardment inadvertently killed 230 civilians who had been sheltering from the fighting inside. Quickly occupied by Fallschirmjäger, who were elite German paratroopers, to add to the disaster, the aerial bombardment campaign had not been coordinated with Allied attacks on the ground, which led to heavy losses by Indian and Maori ground forces when they attacked the next day. The same day as the Allied ground assault on Monte Cassino, German forces at Anzio launched their long-anticipated counteroffensive. Now outnumbering the Allies by 25,000 troops, along with enough tanks to make a serious attempt at destroying the Allies' beachhead, over the course of 3 days, the Germans pushed the Allies back to their final defensive line until intensive Allied artillery fire stopped the Germans in their tracks. In the months since the Anzio landings began, both sides had taken heavy casualties estimated at over 20,000 on either side, and while the situation at Anzio had devolved into a bloody standoff, Allied war leaders believed that the number of German soldiers pulled off the Gustav Line to fight at Anzio now made Monte Cassino one of the weakest strongholds along the Gustav Line, leading to a third attack on the monastery, this time focused on the surrounding town of Cassino. Beginning on March 15th, 435 Allied aircraft bombed the town of Cassino with a less than 50% accuracy rate. Next came a punishing artillery attack, including 746 pieces, which delivered some 200,000 rounds onto enemy positions within the town. The artillery attack managed to pulverize much of the town and kill some 150 of 300 German paratroopers of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, yet the elite force managed to deliver effective resistance despite their heavy losses. House-to-house combat would continue for the next 9 days despite rounds of slogging rain. Yet after 3 attempts to break the Gustav Line at Monte Cassino, the Allies tried one last time to break through under Operation Diadem. Commanded by Sir Harold Alexander, the British Field Marshal quickly concluded that he needed more manpower, resulting in the secret redeployment of the British 8th Army from the east coast of Italy to the west. This time, rather than the staggered offensives that had doomed each previous attempt, Alexander planned to send both armies into a simultaneous attack along a 25-mile front, just as Allied troops at Anzio would launch a breakout towards Valmontone on Highway 6. This time, with a total of 15 Allied divisions bearing down on Monte Cassino, the offensive would represent a 3-to-1 advantage over German defenders, which would be preceded by an artillery bombardment employing over 1,600 guns. At 2300 hours on May the 11th, heavy guns like the 7.2-inch Howitzer Mark IV opened fire along the entire 25-mile front, followed by a coordinated advance of Allied infantry and tanks that broke through at Monte Magno, a place the Germans believed to be impassable and thus poorly defended by the Wehrmacht. 2 days later, the Moroccan Gaumiers routed the German defenders at Monte Magno before pushing up into the Liri Valley. As the offensive unfolded, Allied air attacks savaged Kesselring's supply lines, while Allied deception operations had forced Kesselring to divert forces from the Gustav Line, leading much of his line to buckle by May 15th, save for his troops at Monte Cassino. Though the French forces had made good progress, the British were still forcing their way through one of the heavily defended parts of the line. Attacking again on May the 17th, the British, along with 2 Polish divisions, fought through the night on the slopes of Monte Cassino, and by morning, Monte Cassino and all of the Gustav Line was at last under Allied control. A week later, the Allies began their breakout from Anzio, this time with a numerical advantage in terms of manpower and artillery, which ultimately broke through the German lines. Linking up on May 25th with the rest of the Fifth Army, the Allies now had a continuous front along the entirety of the Gustav Line. Always hungry for publicity, instead of chasing the Germans out of Italy as ordered by Alexander, Clark defied his superior's orders by sending his troops directly into Rome, knowing that his defiance would put him on the front page of every newspaper around the world. Clark's thirst to be known as the liberator of Rome goes down incredibly badly in World War II history, allowing the Germans to escape into northern Italy, where the Allies would have to face them yet again at the Gothic Line. Whatever publicity Clark hoped to reap from his insubordination finally was upstaged by the D-Day landings the same day he entered Rome. Considered the costliest battle during the Italian campaign, the Battle of Monte Cassino witnessed 55,000 Allied casualties, while the Germans suffered more than 20,000. As for the Italian campaign itself, by the time German forces surrendered in Italy in late April of 1945, the Allies had suffered 312,000 casualties, including 65,000 killed in action, while the Germans had suffered 434,000. The campaign also led to the death of Mussolini at the hands of his own people, followed by a civil war in fascist-controlled Italy, during which thousands of partisans and civilians lost their lives, making the Battle of Monte Cassino another high-water standoff against Nazi aggression.